Many years would pass and many battles would occur before David was ready to become king. That day came when King Saul and 3 of his sons, including Jonathan, were killed in a battle between the Israelites and the Philistines. When David learned about the deaths of King Saul and his sons, his heart was filled with great sorrow. David would never forget Jonathan, whom he loved as a brother. David knew the time had come for him to take the position of king. The Lord instructed him to go to Judah in the town of Hebron. David, his family, and all the men who followed him traveled to Hebron, and there he was crowned king of Judah. At that time, the tribes of Israel split into 2 groups. One group was called Israel, and the other group was called Judah. After Saul's death, Abner, the commander of King Saul's army, brought in Saul's son, Ishbosheth, and made him king over Israel. So Israel had Ishbosheth as their king, and Judah had David as their king. For 7.5 years, there was continual war between Israel and Judah. Judah and the house of David grew stronger and stronger, while Israel, led by their commander Abner, grew weaker and weaker. When Abner saw this, he went before the elders of Israel and said, "For a long time you've wanted to make David your king. Now do it! For the Lord promised him, 'It will be by David that I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of all their enemies.'" So all the elders of Israel went to David in Hebron, where they anointed David as king over all of Israel. As king of Israel, David wanted to do one very important thing, and that was to bring the Ark of God, which contained the 2 stone tablets of God's covenants, back to Jerusalem. David gathered 30,000 chosen men of Israel and brought the Ark of God back to Jerusalem and placed it in a sacred tent. David was a man after God's own heart, and he ruled with strength and courage. In the years ahead, David would bring many victories and great peace to the land of the Israelites by following the commands of God. But he also made a serious and painful mistake that would result in harsh and bitter consequences for him and his future descendants. It all began one evening as he was walking on the roof of his palace that overlooked the city of Jerusalem. He saw a married woman named Bathsheba bathing in her house below. She was so beautiful that he sent messengers to her home and asked her to come to the palace. She stayed the night with King David, and the next morning he sent her home. Later, Bathsheba sent word to David that she was pregnant. David knew that he had committed a terrible sin in the sight of God, but what he did next only made it worse. When he found out that Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, was fighting in battle for him, he sent for him to come to the palace. When Uriah arrived, he refused to go to his own home and slept in the entrance of the palace with all the rest of the servants. When David saw that Uriah would not go home, he sent word to his commander, Joab, to place Uriah on the front lines of the battle where the fighting was most fierce. Just as King David had planned, the next day Uriah was placed on the front lines and soon killed in battle while defending Israel. Bathsheba mourned for her husband, and after her period of mourning was over, David sent for Bathsheba, and they were soon married. David's sinful behavior greatly displeased the Lord. Therefore, he sent a prophet named Nathan to King David. Nathan told David, "There were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and one poor. The rich man had many sheep and cattle, but the poor man only had one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised it and grew it up with his children. He loved the little lamb so much that it shared his food, drank from his cup, and slept in his arms. A visitor came to the rich man's house, and instead of taking one of his own animals to feed the visitor that night, he took the ewe lamb from the poor man to feed to his visitor. When David heard this story, he became enraged and said, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over for doing such a thing to another man." Then Nathan the prophet said to David, You are that man. The Lord God of Israel says, was it not enough that I anointed you to be king over all Israel? I gave you everything you could have ever wanted, and I would have given you even more. Why have you hated the word of the Lord by doing such evil in his eyes? Now, because of what you have done, there will always be trouble and conflict in your family. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned greatly against my Lord. And Nathan replied, You are not going to die, because the Lord has forgiven your sin. But because of your sin, your son born to you by Bathsheba will not live. David's son was born. 7 days later, the child died. David and Bathsheba were heartbroken. About a year later, Bathsheba became pregnant again and gave birth to another son. They named him Solomon, and the Lord loved him very much. David reigned for 40 years, doing what was just and right for all people. He loved God and walked faithfully before the Lord with all of his heart and soul.